Hello bookworms, I'm Hannah, and today I'm sharing my October wrap-up. In the month of October, I read 4 children's books, 7 middle grade novels, 2 YA books, and 6 adult novels for a total of 19 books. Normally, I only discuss 4 and 5-star books in my monthly wrap-up videos, but since I posted an October TBR video sharing the spooky books I plan to read, I've decided to briefly touch on the horror and gothic lit novels I read that wouldn't normally have made the cut, and I'll be sharing my thoughts on John Green's new book, Turtles All the Way Down. Of the spooky books I hope to read, there were 2 I didn't have time for. Sadly, those books are My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier and the collection of short stories and poems by Edgar Allan Poe, which I was really looking forward to reading. I hope to read both books sooner rather than later, but for obvious reasons, I won't be reviewing them in today's video. Let's start with the spooky books that didn't quite live up to my expectations, beginning with an impromptu mid-month purchase, Thornhill by Pam Smye, a middle-grade horror novel that tells the story of 2 girls in interwoven alternating plot lines. Mary is a quiet orphan girl who lives at the Thornhill Institute for Children in 1982, and Erin is a motherless girl who, in 2017, moves into the house across the street from the dilapidated building that used to be Thornhill. Mary's troubling experience at Thornhill is conveyed through her journal entries, while Erin's efforts to unravel what happened at Thornhill is portrayed through a wordless graphic novel. I picked up this book because I recently heard someone describe it as the creepiest book they've had the pleasure of putting into the hands of middle graders. The creepiest middle grade novel I've read is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. I love that book, so I had to know if this book is scarier. It's not. Thornhill proved such a disappointment. Mary's journal entries are flat and unadorned. Erin's story is slightly more compelling because Smye's striking illustrations are visually interesting and easy to follow, but none of them shocked or startled me. Thornhill is recommended for children ages 10 to 14 because it deals with some difficult subjects like bullying and death. It's dark, but it is not scary. If curiosity gets the better of you and you just can't resist reading Thornhill, I recommend checking it out from the library. Next up is Dracula by Bram Stoker, a gothic horror novel first published in 1897 about a young English solicitor who visits Count Dracula's castle in Transylvania, where he discovers bizarre nightly activities and fears for his life. The key to enjoying Dracula is to imagine reading it in 1897. This was the first novel to introduce vampires, so readers had no idea why characters had bite marks on their necks and were dying slowly for inexplicable reasons. In 1897, the scenes where a woman is kneeling down, or one instance where a woman is forced to bend down and made to open her mouth to drink blood, were sexually explicit because they implied oral sex. The same goes for a scene in which a vampire is writhing in its coffin, shaking and quivering until its body is calmed and lays still, which was a parody of a person orgasming. Once upon a time, this book was scintillating and scary, but by today's standards, its pacing is glacial and its content is tame. Even the prose lacks the lyricism and elegance one can often anticipate from books published in the 19th century. Dracula is intriguing in the sense that it explores the unconscious mind and the nature of repression in a spooky setting with mythical creatures, but it's a challenging read because of its slow pacing and low stakes. Before I move on, I want to correct the connection drawn in my spooky books video between Dracula and The Beetle by Richard Marsh. I was given the impression these books are similar because they have some fundamental things in common. But now that I've read both books, I think that comparison is an injustice to The Beetle, which is a far more tightly woven, engaging book. Next up is The Shining by Stephen King, the story of writer Jack Torrance taking a job as the off-season caretaker at the Overlook Hotel. Harsh winter weather arrives and Jack, along with his wife and son, are isolated at the hotel. Jack's 5-year-old son Danny has a strange yet special gift, one that makes him the first to realize the Torrance family is trapped at a hotel where a menacing spectral entity resides. I went into The Shining anticipating a narrative with tense plot pacing and terrifying scenes that would haunt my dreams. But this isn't a book about a haunted hotel so much as it's a novel about a man haunted by his alcoholism. This is less about scares and more about the complicated dynamics of family and the myriad forms in which our inner demons materialize. When Stephen King wrote Misery, the psycho nurse character was representative of the addictions he struggled with at that time, addictions that held him captive and made it difficult for him to write. The Shining is similar in terms of thematic context. Much like it, this book is laden with exposition and backstory. It's 100 pages before the family even arrives at the hotel, and it's 300 pages before something legitimately creepy finally occurs. I had high hopes for The Shining, but this book failed to hit all these spooky high notes I was searching for in my October reading. However, I will never look at hedge animals the same ever again. Moving on, we get to The Rats by James Herbert, a dystopian horror novel in which London is plagued by swarms of rats who have developed an unbridled taste for human flesh. Fun fact, a group of rats is called a mischief. I went into this book not knowing when it had been published, but I soon guessed, based on the descriptions of women generally being reduced to the size and bounciness of their breasts, that it was likely published in the 70s, and I was right. Thanks to the sophomoric way Herbert writes about women, I did a lot of eye-rolling while reading this book. However, I thoroughly enjoyed the abundance of gruesome descriptions of people being eaten alive. No one is safe in this book, be they man or beast, adult or child. Horror is supposed to shock and disgust, and in that sense, The Rats is a success. You know that one scene in Gone Girl with the wine bottle? Yeah. James Herbert did it first. There's nothing particularly memorable about The Rats. Upon completion, the characters immediately faded from my mind. The only thing about the book that had a lasting impression on me was how often Herbert limited his descriptions of the rats or their eyes to evil-looking. Staring across at him from the ticket office pay window was a huge, black, evil-looking rat. Barney turned his attention back to his drawing, adding a few more strokes to his strikingly evil-looking rat. A postman delivering letters to a basement flat turned to find 3 sets of evil-looking eyes staring at him. Evil-looking. In my preliminary review of this book on Goodreads, I said it reads like a campy B-movie train wreck you don't want to watch but can't look away from, and that's really the best way I can think of to summarize this book. It's important to note, however, that even though I'm not singing this book's praises, it was fun to read, and I wouldn't be opposed to picking up the next book in the trilogy. Now to touch briefly on Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, a novel I was eager to read but ultimately found underwhelming. My biggest problem with this book is that it's trying to be too many things. Turtles All the Way Down is a contemporary young adult novel about 16-year-old Asa Holmes who struggles with mental illness. Actually, it's a coming-of-age story about a girl coping with the lasting effects of her father's untimely death. But then again, it's a mystery in which Asa dons her sleuthing cap and tries to uncover the truth behind the disappearance of a fugitive billionaire. Or rather, it's a teen romance that portrays not one, but 2 different couples navigating young love. It's also the story of a teen girl unraveling the principles and expectations of friendship. And it's about a girl wrestling with self-identity, trying to understand her place in the world. In other words, this book is all over the place. It's okay to have multiple subplots in a book, but there's so much going on in this novel that each storyline suffers from lack of development. Without the necessary buildup that later allows for emotional payoff, the result is a book that lacks the emotional wallops given by The Fault in Our Stars. Let's get into the best books I read in the month of October in order from least to top favorite, beginning with Fortunately the Milk by Neil Gaiman, illustrated by Scotty Young. It's the story of a boy's father who steps out to buy a bottle of milk and goes on an unexpected adventure that involves talking dragons, enthusiastic pirates, an alien spaceship, and more. This book is a quick read that's visually compelling because every single page is illustrated. Scotty Young's quirky and comedic illustrations are, in my opinion, the best part of the book. If you're a parent who reads to your children and you're looking for a book you can both enjoy reading again and again, be sure to check this one out. Next up is a debut, The Goldfish Boy by Lisa Thompson, a middle grade mystery that's being suitably heralded as Rear Window meets The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. It follows 12-year-old Matthew Corbin, who's generally confined to his bedroom because he suffers from intense OCD. He prefers to keep to himself, but since he makes a habit of watching his neighborhood from his bedroom window, he's the last person to see a little boy before he goes missing, so Matthew is inevitably drawn into the police investigation. Matthew makes for a memorably flawed protagonist. Thompson's depiction of his struggle with mental illness set a new standard for me, and since I read this book before reading Turtles All the Way way down, it framed my view of reading about characters with mental illness. Matthew's struggle with mental illness complements the story but hinders his ability to solve the mystery, which remains a compelling focal point of the narrative from start to finish. This turned out to be a good fit for the month of October because it's occasionally unsettling. If you're looking for a slightly creepy, alluring mystery that will keep you up late turning pages, check out The Goldfish Boy. Let's talk about the latest young adult novel from Jason Reynolds, Long Way Down, a cautionary tale written in verse about 15-year-old Will Holloman, who is forced to consider the potential consequences of his actions as he, armed with a gun and seeking revenge, waits for the elevator in his building to reach the ground floor. Jason Reynolds has referred to this book as a strange intersection between A Christmas Carol and Boys in the Hood. Odd as it sounds, that's a perfect description. Reynolds demonstrates an intelligent economy of words in this book, tackling drugs, gangs, gun violence, grief, and the protagonist's desire to avenge his brother's murder with hard-hitting, emotive verse that strikes with a staccato rhythm. I've never read a book that empowers its readers in the same unique way this book does. If you're looking for a quick read that will emotionally ravage you, this is the book for you. I'm so glad I finally got around to reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the story of a young scientist named Victor Frankenstein who creates a grotesque sentient monster. Frankenstein is a story within a story within a story. 3 tales of woe unfold across the pages of this book, and they are conveyed in some of the most breathtaking prose to meet my eyes. The narrative starts strong, slows a bit at the midpoint, but finds its rhythm once more before arriving at a memorable conclusion. Fun fact, Mary Shelley was 18 years old when she started writing Frankenstein. She was 20 when the first edition was published anonymously in 1818. Her name didn't appear on the book until the second edition was published in France 5 years later. Frankenstein is what I call a double delight. It stands well on its own as the story of a monster doing terrible things, but it also presents greater depths for anyone interested in exploring its themes of self-disgust, the need for belonging, and the violent nature of mankind. If you enjoy atmospheric, mournful stories crafted from gorgeous prose and you still haven't read Frankenstein, it's time to bump this book up on your TBR. Let's get an obvious 5-star book out of the way, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I'm not going to say much about this book except that I couldn't resist reading it again. If you want to hear me talk more about Harry Potter, I did a Harry Potter book tag video months ago, and I'll drop a link to that video in the description box down below. Now we get to a book that took me completely by surprise and earned a spot on my favorites list, The Monk by Matthew Lewis. First published in 1796, The Monk is a gothic horror novel about a respected monk named Ambrosio who is overtaken with desire for a young girl. When his longing is too much to bear, Ambrosio abandons his monastic vows and begins a terrifying descent into a life of depravity. When this book debuted, it was published anonymously and it shocked the world. It was condemned for being blasphemous and obscene. In fact, the reading public was so offended by its content that a year after publication, an injunction was obtained to prohibit sale of the book. Lewis removed the passages he presumed were objectionable before a second edition was released under his name, but the book maintained its lurid reputation. Which version did I read? The unedited one, obviously. The monk's depiction of the fall of man as he succumbs to the power of greed and desire is still beguiling over 200 years after it was first published. Unlike Dracula, which must be read with the year of its publication in mind to justify its modern-day shortcomings, The Monk is scintillating and steamy even by today's standards. Some of its darker aspects remain disturbing, and the immoral behavior of its characters provide tension and intrigue. Similar to Frankenstein, there are 2 occasions when The Monk is a story within a story. Each narrative is given sufficient time to fully develop, such that this book offers 3 captivating tales of woe. But the most entrancing element of this book is the prose. On countless occasions, I paused, reread, and savored the richness and sophistication of Lewis's writing. The Monk has my favorite portrayal of foreshadow, and it has what is perhaps the most satisfying conclusion of any book I've read. The final scene is satiating and unforgettable. Just thinking about it right now is making me want to read the book all over again. In short, I love this book, and I can't recommend it highly enough for anyone who enjoys devastating stories of diabolical characters and scandalous acts conveyed with transcendent prose. This final book gave me everything I wanted from my October reads. It set a new standard for horror novels and makes The Shining look like child's play. That book is Hex by Thomas Olde Heufeld. It's the story of a little town called Black Springs that's haunted by a 17th century woman with her eyes and mouth sewn shut, who lets herself into people's homes and watches them while they sleep. Conceptually, I found that synopsis terrifying, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I started reading this book at night alone, and I made it 2 chapters in before I had to stop because it was freaking me out. The next day, I started reading while it was still light out, but it's such a tense, mesmerizing story that I continued reading well into the night, and I was terrified the entire time. There were several instances where I had to stop reading this book because my heart was pounding so hard in my chest that it hurt. This book made me jumpy for days. I was easily startled in the daylight, terrified of dark rooms, plagued with nightmares, but I was continually drawn back to this book even though it scared the hell out of me because the story is so riveting. The English version of this book has a different ending than the original Dutch edition. Since finishing the book, I've learned how the Dutch edition concludes, and I'm really glad I read Hex in English because I love the way this book ends. If you've read Hex and can recommend something equally frightening, please tell me about it in the comments below. If you're looking for a tense book that will legitimately terrify you, make you jump at shadows, fear being alone, and look warily over your shoulder while you're reading, then Hex is the book for you. What was the best book you read in the month of October, and how do you feel about the books discussed in today's video? Tell me in the comments below. Now that my fantastic month of October reading is behind me, it's time for Non-Fiction November. I'll drop a link in the description box to a video I posted that features 27 non-fiction books for anyone interested in reading about bizarre facts, motivational wisdom, or noteworthy historical figures. Thanks, everybody!